Gods and Generals is the most offensive Civil War movie since the birth of a nation. It's also objectively terrible. The extended edition is nearly 5 hours long, and frankly, I'd rather face a firing squad than put myself through it again. It's exhausting and sanctimonious, and if you're not a huge Civil War buff like me, you'll just get nothing out of it. But oddly enough, this dull, flaccid, utterly inane excuse for entertainment is an extremely effective piece of propaganda. Watching this, I get the creepy sense that the entire reason Gods and Generals exists is to convince Civil War buffs that the Confederacy wasn't really all that bad, that it was about states' rights after all, and that the antebellum South was just a porch-sitting, lemonade-sipping paradise.
Here is to the sultry, balmy South.
As we'll see, the truth was otherwise.
We'll take the ones Platt and Eliza.
Sold, Eliza and Platt, Splendid.
Before we proceed, I'd like to get one thing absolutely clear. The Confederate States of America existed primarily to preserve and expand the institution of slavery. Confederate soldiers were fighting for slavery, and they knew it.
That's not an opinion, it's a fact.
As the saying goes,
facts don't care about your feelings.
If you disagree, I encourage you to watch on and have your beliefs challenged in a healthy way. Because if you truly know that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, then surely one YouTube video by a confirmed FARB isn't going to change your mind, right? As early as 1922, Vladimir Lenin recognized film as an important tool for spreading political propaganda. In his case, he was trying to reinforce Marxist principles in the minds of the Russian people. But even before Lenin, and certainly ever since, film has been used to further the spread of pretty much every ideology under the sun. There's fascism, anti-fascism, classical liberalism, militarism, anti-militarism, leftism, nationalism, anti-nationalism, theism, anti-theism, anti-colonialism, and so on. But just because these films advocate a certain point of view doesn't automatically make them manipulative or bad. Some propaganda pieces are more insidious than others, and often a film with a bias can be thought-provoking in a positive and enlightening way.
You're all individuals!
Yes, we're all individuals!
You're all different!
Yes, we are all different!
I'm not.
Even if I disagree with the message, I can still dig a good propaganda film if it's well made or entertaining. But whether benignly thought-provoking or blatantly ideological, these movies have one thing in common. The filmmakers are trying to sell you something. In the case of Gods and Generals, director Ron Maxwell is pushing the tired, old, thoroughly debunked, right-wing talking points of the lost cause myth. But Andy, I hear you thinking, you've made several videos criticizing Confederate apologists. Your position on this issue is clear. Surely you have a bias of your own. In a way, this video is a piece of propaganda too. Whoa, meta dude! And for that matter, doesn't every filmmaker have their own biases that filter into their work, consciously or not? Well, no. For example, let's briefly look at a film that many consider to be right-wing propaganda, but which actually isn't. S. Craig Zahler's Dragged Across Concrete. It's about two aging, old-school cops who get suspended because they use excessive force while arresting a Latino man. In the scene where their boss breaks the bad news, the cops voice their frustration with political correctness and the liberal distrust of police officers, which they feel inhibits their ability to properly do their job. Some audiences saw this scene as an implicit endorsement of this conservative, anti-PC viewpoint, but nothing could be further from the truth. If you actually watch the movie, which is pretty damn good by the way, it's clear that the characters played by Mel Gibson and Vince Vaughn are not winking at the audience. It's just that they're aging, old-school cops. They've been doxxed by the Twitter outrage machine, so of course they would express those views in that situation. There's a big difference between fictional characters in a movie expressing certain opinions.
Figure a man's only good for one oath at a time. I took mine to the Confederate States of America.
And a filmmaker trying to indoctrinate his or her audience with a specific political agenda. I'm about to explain in detail why Gods and Generals fits into the latter category, and in so doing, spits historical accuracy right in the face. Gods and Generals is a stupid movie. It's not Paul Blart Mall Cop kind of stupid. But because it completely lacks depth and nuance, it has to telegraph to the audience what they should be feeling at any given moment. The principal way it does this is through the use of its score. Take this scene, where the Virginia House of Delegates declares that state's intention to secede from the Union.
How could there be union with a section of the country that wants to impose its will through coercion?
Oh, you mean like slavery does? Never mind, we'll get to that. So at this point, Robert E. Lee has gotten up in front of everybody and accepts the position as commander of the Confederate Army. Watch this, and listen carefully. Did you notice that? The soaring, triumphant John Williams-y music? What might have motivated that choice? What does the director, Ron Maxwell, want us to feel in this moment? Either he's a complete moron and thinks that every rousing speech needs triumphant music, or he wants us to feel inspired and uplifted that the South is seceding from the Union. I'm leaning toward the latter, especially when you see scenes like this.
And in my own Rockford County, only one person voted against leaving the Union.
Probably the village idiot.
Yeah, the village idiot was the one who wanted to prevent a fucking war. What an idiot! Consider also the sequence depicting the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, this is as close as Gods and Generals comes to a climactic moment, and historically it was the Confederacy's greatest victory, where Stonewall Jackson brilliantly steamrolled over the Federal right flank. Check out the music in this scene. This cue turns the battle scene into nothing less than neo-Confederate porn. The bellicose chorus turns the Army of Northern Virginia into this unstoppable, completely badass, avenging force. It's meant to get your blood pumping, and it succeeds. It's a great cue. I'm as anti-Confederate as they come, and this scene has even me going, yeah, fuck them Yankees up, pour it into them, boys. Finally, let's look at Stonewall Jackson's death scene at the end of the film. Spoilers, by the way. This is an incredibly melodramatic scene. It's just goofy and all over the place, but what's really telling is the heavenly choir singing in the score. It indicates martyrdom, and even though Jackson got pointlessly gunned down by his own men by mistake, his death is depicted as a pseudo-religious sacrifice. He even has his hand raised in this saintly way. And just before he goes, this look comes across his face like he's seeing the gates of heaven opening up. It's a Christ-like demise, and the film clearly implies that he gave his life nobly for a good cause. The last shot of the extended edition is a slow push-in on Jackson's coffin, and the stainless banner draped over it. The camera settles on the top left section of the flag to the Confederate cross that we all know and love. This is what Jackson died for, the film is saying. He gave his life to defend what this flag represents. Gettysburg, Maxwell's previous Civil War film, is not a masterpiece by any means, but it does do a pretty good job of maintaining a neutral point of view. In the immortal words of George Lucas, there are heroes on both sides. It works in Gettysburg because that film focuses on military history, and apart from one little scene,
I'm fighting for my rats. Obviously, that's what we're fighting for. For your what? For our rats.
It doesn't really delve into the social or political history of the 1860s. Not so with Gods and Generals. The first 45 minutes or so are filled with tedious speech after speech about the virtues of the Southern cause.
Just as we would not send any of our soldiers to march in other states and tyrannize other people, so will we never allow the armies of others to march into our state.
Nevertheless, Maxwell pretends that this film is a no-spin zone, and pretty much spells it out for us in this scene toward the end, where Colonel Chamberlain and his wife go to see a production of Julius Caesar starring John Wilkes Booth.
It's for the audience to decide who is hero and who is villain.
Whoa, meta, dude! It's frankly insulting that after 4.5 hours of shoving neo-Confederate revisionism down our throats, Maxwell tells us, please make up your own mind, especially since lots of that propaganda is pretty convincing. Take these words that Maxwell puts in Stonewall Jackson's mouth.
If Virginia adheres to the United States, I adhere. Her determination must control mine. This is my understanding of patriotism. And though I love the Union, I love Virginia more.
That sounds reasonable, right? As an American, I value individualism and self-reliance. I love my country, but I do love my family, friends, and local community more. And I would fight for those things if I had to.
If the North triumphs, it is not alone the destruction of our property. It is the prelude to anarchy, infidelity, the ultimate loss of free and responsible government on this continent. It is the triumph of commerce, the banks, factories.
Yeah, I hate banks too.
If the Republicans lose their little war, they are voted out in the next election and they return to their homes in New York or Massachusetts or Illinois, fat with their war profits. If we lose our country.
War profiteers are awful. Maybe this whole secession thing isn't as bad as some folks say. Maybe it wasn't just all about... Oh look, it's Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy. I wonder what he has to say. The prevailing ideas entertained by the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. See how easy it is to fall for this lost cause shit? And if Gods and Generals is a neutral examination of Civil War history, as Maxwell claims, then shouldn't the Yankees get just as much play as the Confederates? Well, yeah, they should, but they don't. Not even close. With the exception of the Chamberlain brothers, Buster Kilrain, and Winfield Scott Hancock, all of whom are minor, incidental characters, the Yankees in this film are either portrayed as asshole bureaucrats.
I trust you're not being too hasty yourself, Colonel. This is a great opportunity for you to serve your country.
Asshole politicians.
I congratulate the Army that the numbers of casualties have been comparatively so small.
Compared to what? The Scots at Culloden.
Or asshole generals who don't listen to good advice from their subordinates.
General Hancock, I certainly appreciate your efforts at reconnaissance, but this possibility has been considered and rejected.
And, of course, plundering, thieving violators of our homes and firesides. This is an old lost cause stereotype of the Union Army, that it was an aggressive, invading force that attacked Southern civilians, burned their homes, and confiscated their property. While this sort of thing did occasionally happen, the worst offenses weren't committed by the regular Federal Army, but by pro-Union paramilitaries, particularly out west in Kansas and Missouri.
What the hell is this red leg doing here? You said regular federal authorities would be handling this.
Captain Terrell is the regular federal authority now.
Captain Terrell is a bloodthirsty son of a bitch. He is a looter and a pillager.
So Maxwell goes out of his way to portray the Confederates as plucky rebels fighting against an evil federal empire. And with a couple notable exceptions, that wasn't the case historically. Secession was orchestrated by an aristocratic planter class that correctly anticipated the imminent end of American slavery that was so vital to the Southern economy. Even white Southerners who advocated conditional abolitionism, such as phasing slavery out over a long period of time, knew that without millions of free laborers, the agrarian economy of the Cotton States would suffer, maybe even collapse. So the planters, who had enormous political influence, ultimately decided that they would rather rip the country in half than risk their bottom line. Most of the famous Confederate soldiers came from the planter class. Robert E. Lee was born rich, the son of a dynastic political family. His father was governor of Virginia, and his uncle served in the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War. Jeb Stuart's father was a plantation owner and career politician. Nathan Bedford Forrest, though born poor, amassed a huge fortune before the war through speculation and slave trading. My boy James Longstreet grew up on a plantation. P.T. Beauregard was from a stinking rich family in DeParish. George Pickett came from old Virginia money and got most of his career opportunities through nepotism. Thomas J. Jackson, well, Stonewall was a bit different, but we'll get more into that later. Yet in Gods and Generals we see privileged, elitist Yankees in a parlor with their whiskey and cigars, while the Confederates huddle around a simple campfire with their men. Y'all need to stop pretending that these guys were men of the people. They weren't. They were men of privilege dedicated to preserving the status quo. And just what was that status quo?
It is the systematic coercion of one group of men over another.
Well said, Chamberlain, you overhyped hack. Strong Vincent rolls in his grave every time the history books mention you. By the way, this scene with the Chamberlain brothers is interesting.
Freeing the slaves wasn't a war aim when this all began, but war changes things. It sorts things out.
I don't know, Lawrence. I mean, not everybody feels the way we do about the darkies. Especially when it comes to fighting and dying.
This is the only racial slur used by anyone in the entire movie. This neutral, nonpartisan Civil War film features one racial slur, and it comes out of the mouth of a Union soldier. And how do the Confederate characters treat black people? Why, like members of the family, of course. There are 3 black characters in Gods and Generals, and they're either super down with the Confederacy, or they want to be free despite the fact that they love their masters.
I love them people you done chased from this house. I've known them most all my life.
This is how the actors describe their characters in the film.
If I was born in that time period, I would have been subservient, yes. I would be doing the yawsum and nosum and, you know, trying to survive. But I think that because of who I am in the back of my mind, it's like, you're going to take me only so far. And then at one point, I'm going to say, no.
It's easy for somebody to say, oh, well, honey, I'd just get on out of there. Well, maybe you would, but where are you going? You know, you might run to that North Star, but Martha had 3 little children. What are you going to do?
These are fair points. In the Louisiana Slave Revolt of 1811, a quarter of the slaves of the German coast region joined the rebellion, but 3/4 remained loyal. Was this because they had genuine love for their masters? In certain cases, yes. But for the vast majority, they decided not to take up arms because they calculated the risks of revolt and decided that it was likely to fail. Sadly, they were right. You see this same calculation in revolts and revolutions all throughout history. In the Jewish revolt against the Romans in the 1st century AD, much of the violence was between competing Jewish sects, some pro-revolt, others pro-Roman. The Romans eventually won.
Judean People's Front. Well, the People's Front of Judea.
In King Philip's War, the Mohegan tribe, among others, sided with the English colonists against the native confederation that opposed them. The English eventually won. And in the American Revolution, Tories across the colonies clashed with rebels both politically and militarily. The rebels eventually won, against all odds. The instinct of self-preservation is biological and deeply ingrained in all human beings. But loyal American slaves weren't like this.
Y'all be coming on back here.
They were like this. I'll grant you that loyal slaves existed, but I question Ron Maxwell's choice to feature these slave characters specifically in his film, and no others. This is a whitewashed, hugely historically inaccurate portrayal of American slavery. It wasn't like this. It was like this.
Come on, Wednesday Merriman, move your feet.
The way I see it, if you're a filmmaker and you want to portray American slavery, you have an obligation to depict it accurately. This PG-13, kid-friendly, cotton candy bullshit leads the general movie-going public to think that slavery wasn't all that bad, and that has dangerous, real-world ramifications. Now, this might strike some of my longtime viewers as somewhat hypocritical. In the past, I've defended movies like Braveheart against those who obsess over historical inaccuracy. But ultimately, it doesn't matter whether the general public thinks William Wallace wore a kilt. It does matter that they think that slaves were happy and loved their masters like family.
I loved them people you done chased from this house.
Fuck you, Ron. This movie is basically a dry chronicle of the events of the first 2 years of the war in the Eastern Theater. I'm sure a huge amount of research was done on troop movements, battle tactics, and the lives of the soldiers portrayed. Thousands of Civil War reenactors took part in this film, men deeply concerned with getting minute historical details absolutely correct. So it's deeply ironic that Gods and Generals is one of the least historically accurate movies ever made, for the simple reason that it deliberately omits the true horror of slavery.
Gentlemen, let us lift our glasses to our Southern women, without whose bravery and fortitude, without whose love, without whose endurance and sacrifice, not a man among us can stay the course and defend the cause.
Sell her.
That might seem like a good place to stop on this topic, but
I'm not done yet.
There are two black characters who help out the Confederate Army. There's Jim Lewis, who's Stonewall Jackson's free cook, and this guy in the Confederate hat, who's also a free man of color, who only appears in the extended edition of the film. Here's his deal.
Where's your master now?
I ain't got no master no more. Now he my boss. See, I was sold at auction up in Fredericksburg once, and he bought me for $1,200. Then the war come, that didn't set right with him, so he gave me my freedom papers. Now he pays me wages.
You know, black people had it pretty good before those goddamn Yankees came along.
Then them Yankees come and burn down his house, and the next thing you know, the man who's paying me wages is in the Confederate Army. And so am I.
He's not really in the Confederate Army. Black men were forbidden by law to enlist in the Confederate Army. Jim and the guy with the hat—
That's an impeccable hat, sir. Thank you, sir.
represent a tiny minority of African Americans who aided the Confederate war effort. The vast majority, yeah, you guessed it, were slaves who were forced to work manual labor in support of the Army. Confederate apologists will often point to the 1st Louisiana Native Guard, a unit raised in my own city of New Orleans, as definitive proof that black Confederate soldiers existed. In actual fact, the Native Guard was made up of mixed-race Creole free people of color who were themselves part of the aristocratic planter class. Yeah, we've always done things a little differently down in New Orleans. And they never seem to mention the fact that the Native Guard promptly switched sides when the Union Army captured the city in 1862. Anyway, later on in the film, Hat Guy's master dies in battle, and this is what he has to say.
This here rebel, give me my freedom papers.
For Christ's sake, can we have one black person in this movie who doesn't regard white people with unconditional loyalty and affection? Just one. But perhaps Gods and General's greatest crimes against history are the lines put in the mouth of Jim Lewis.
Lexington is my home, General. Same as yourn. If I could do my share in defending my home, I'd be doing the same as you.
Oh my god, this movie hurts my brain. The tragedy here is that Jim had some potential to be a really interesting character. A free black man deciding to support the Confederacy to earn a wage and survive, but who has family still enslaved and is struggling with conflicting loyalties? I'd like to watch that movie. It could have been original and ballsy and something that really would have taken audiences out of their comfort zone. But remember, this movie is incredibly dumb, and Maxwell barely skims the surface of that potential. In this scene, Stonewall and Jim share a prayer, and Jim essentially challenges the general about the Confederates' defense of slavery.
How is it, Lord? How is it a good Christian man, like some folks I know, can tolerate their black brothers in bondage?
In a smarter movie, this remark would maybe cause some tension in Jim's relationship with Jackson. Maybe it would cause Jackson to have doubts about the righteousness of the Confederate cause and question whether the preservation of slavery really is part of God's plan. Instead, he says this.
Jim, you must know that there are
are some officers in this army who are of the opinion that we should be enlisting Negroes as a condition for freedom.
That's what they says round the camp.
I doubt anyone's been saying that round the camp. This was a fringe belief in the Confederate Army, and if certain officers advocated enlisting slaves as a condition for freedom, they would not have been talking about it publicly in 1862. It would have seemed insane. The Confederacy was still doing well. It was holding its own against the Federal juggernaut. The first Confederate officer to seriously propose this was General Patrick Claiborne in 1864, after the tide of war had turned firmly against the South. Early in 1865, General Lee came out in support of the idea, but the Confederate Congress didn't authorize the use of black soldiers until March 1865, when things were getting really desperate. In any event, it was too little too late, and Lee surrendered to Grant a month later.
Your people will be free, one way at a time.
The best lies flirt with the truth, and Jackson's stated position on slavery is no exception. We actually know very little about Jackson's actual opinions on this, and much of what we do know comes from the memoirs of his wife Anna, written 30 years after the war. Stonewall was somewhat unique among high-ranking Confederates in that he came from a working-class background, and spent much of his childhood and adolescence working his uncle's mill. He probably worked alongside slaves every day. It's entirely possible that due to this experience, the young Jackson considered slaves more as people than as property. In the 1850s, Jackson ran a Sunday school for slaves and free people of color. Lost causers will claim that such a school was illegal, and that Jackson was some sort of early civil rights pioneer. But in truth, there were many other schools like that in Virginia at the time. So was Jackson one of the good Confederates, like Longstreet and Mosby? It's hard to say, because he was taken from us so young. But it's important to note that before the war, he was a fairly typical upper-middle-class slave owner. In Gods and Generals, Jackson's own slaves are notably absent, even in scenes taking place at his house in Lexington where they would have lived. Stonewall owned at least 6 slaves, and according to Anna, "He was a very strict but kind master, giving his servants that which is just and equal, but exacting from them proper obedience. His training made the colored servants as polite and punctual as that race is capable of being, and his system soon showed its good effects. They realized that if they did their duty, they would receive the best of treatment from him. At Christmas, he was generous in presents, and frequently gave them small sums of money." As for Jackson's political views on slavery, Anna says, "I have heard him say that he would prefer to see the Negroes free, but he believed that the Bible taught that slavery was sanctioned by the Creator himself, who maketh men to differ, and instituted laws for the bond and the free. He therefore accepted slavery as it existed in the Southern states, not as a thing desirable in itself, but as allowed by Providence for ends which it was not his business to determine. At the same time, the Negroes had no truer friend, no greater benefactor." This seems to jive with what we know of Jackson's intense religious belief, but as Anna had a vested interest in keeping Jackson's legacy as squeaky clean as possible, I find it hard to believe that Black Americans had no truer friend than Stonewall Jackson. But what does slavery and the Confederacy mean to Ron Maxwell, our director? Well, I'm sorry to say, he's almost certainly one of those "it's heritage, not hate, don't take the statue down, it's history" type of people. How do I know this? If you're watching this, Ron, set your Facebook posts to private. So that was a heavy topic. These past few minutes of the video may have made you angry or uncomfortable. Some of you might be taking to the comments section now to call me a virtue signaler, or a white knight, or a soy boy. Trust me, I've heard them all. But I just want you to know that the reason I often talk about American slavery and criticize the lost cause isn't because I have white guilt, or because I want to feel validated with fake internet points. It's mainly because when I was a young, impressionable history buff making Civil War movies in the woods near my parents' house, bad history from biased lost causers and propaganda films like Gods and Generals convinced me that the war wasn't all about slavery, and that the Confederacy fought for a noble cause, and that the antebellum South wasn't all that bad. When I started to learn the truth, I felt like such a fool. How could I have been taken in by this nonsense? If I can provide a solid resource with good history, if I can reach just one young person who might be entertaining these ideas and convince them otherwise, then this video will have done its job. If you still don't believe me at this point, I'm not sure that anything that I can say can change your mind, so I won't try. I'll let you hear it straight from the horse's mouth. Did you know that we actually have audio recordings from the 30s and 40s of former slaves talking about their experiences? Yeah, right now, in the 21st century, you can listen to the voices of American slaves. And I gotta warn you, the picture they paint is not pretty.
Well, they taken that old woman, poor old woman, carried in the peach orchard and whipped her. And, just tied her hand this way, around the peach orchard tree. I remember that just as well, looked like to me, I can, and round the tree and whipped her. And well, she couldn't do nothing but just kick her feet, just kick her feet. But it just had her clothes off down to her waist, Just didn't have her plumb naked, but they had her clothes down to her waist. And every now and then they'd whip her, and then snuff the pipe out on her, snuff pipe out on her. The embers in the pipe, where you ever see the pipe smoking.
Blow them out on her?
Mm-hmm.
Good Lord.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen how Gods and Generals fails to accurately depict the realities of the Civil War. Now let's examine how the movie fails utterly on a cinematic level. The biggest problem with Gods and Generals is that the film has no discernible story. This was the case with Gettysburg too, but at the very least, Gettysburg had characters that you liked. In Gods and Generals, the characters are all boring. Ron Maxwell's intention here seems to have been to create a visual record of certain key events in the Civil War, but in so doing, he sacrifices narrative and story structure. They go right down the toilet. You might argue that traditional story structure can be constraining and isn't necessarily applicable to all types of movies, and you'd be right. But Gods and Generals wasn't directed by David Lynch. It was directed by Ron Maxwell, and Ron's not that intelligent or thoughtful a filmmaker. He should be directing Paul Blart Mall Cop, not Civil War epics. The trouble with both this movie and Gettysburg is that Maxwell confuses drama with story. Every once in a while something really dramatic will happen, like Stonewall Jackson's little girlfriend dying of fever, or the Confederate Irish Brigade being forced to fire on the Federal Irish Brigade, or Jackson having to oversee the execution of deserters from his beloved Stonewall Brigade. But these overwrought, dramatic moments ultimately have no impact on the story, doing nothing to drive the narrative forward. They don't even provide insights into the characters involved. We already know Jackson's a hard-ass, so when he executes the deserters, he becomes even more of a hard-ass? That's a generous interpretation, because Jackson has no character arc whatsoever. His scenes are watchable because of Stephen Lang's great performance, but ultimately his character's not that interesting. At the beginning of the movie, he's a devout, fiercely patriotic soldier. At the end, he's a devout, fiercely patriotic soldier. There's no change and no growth. But at least Jackson has a personality, unlike some other Confederate generals I know. So this is the first shot of Gods and Generals. Thrilling stuff. Why not have Lee do something? Anything, to showcase a bit of his personality here. I get that the historical Lee was a soft-spoken, somewhat stoic old aristocrat, but does that mean he has to be a block of wood? God, I'm having Season 8 flashbacks.
Bran's character has a lot of development. I remember in this scene particularly, I pulled Bran aside and said, hey Bran, maybe a little less birch, maybe a little more oak.
At least in Gettysburg, Martin Sheen's Lee had emotions. He fretted about the outcome of the battle, and he got pissed off at his subordinates when they screwed up.
I have told you there is no time for that. There is no time.
And he felt like a real person. Yes, Robert Duvall's performance is too understated, but no one can doubt his acting ability. I place the blame squarely on the script and the direction. I'm sure Ron Maxwell would be the first to admit that he's not exactly an actor's director.
Your spirit is vaster than oceans.
Come on, boys! Quick, and we can whip them!
Shouldn't we make some attempt to occupy Fredericksburg and possibly the heights beyond now, while we have it for the taking?
Your spirit is vaster than oceans.
I'm so sorry, Jeff Daniels. What can you do with a line like that? I know the 19th century was a sentimental time and everything, but geez Louise, it's like this movie was written by Tommy Wiseau. But at the same time, we know that Maxwell isn't a complete dum-dum. He's an extremely effective propagandist, yes, but he also understood that he needed to cash in on the success of Gettysburg. By far the best scene of that film is the 20th Maine's desperate defense of Little Round Top. Throughout that sequence, depicting the second day of the battle, the audience emotionally connects with three characters: Colonel Chamberlain, his brother Tom, and Buster Kilrain. So of course they get shoved into this movie. This is the Ron Maxwell Cinematic Universe equivalent of putting C-3PO and R2-D2 into a scene at the Rebel base for no reason.
Scarif? They're going to Scarif? Why does nobody ever tell me anything, R2?
You could have cut the Yankee characters out of this movie completely and you'd barely notice their absence. I say if you're going to make a movie about Stonewall Jackson, make a movie about Stonewall Jackson. If you want to make a movie that's a dry, dull chronicle of the first 2 years of the Civil War, just don't. When I made my video about battle scenes, my subscriber Zachary Kelly said that he was surprised I didn't mention Gettysburg.
I have told you there is no time for that.
I replied that I thought the battle scenes were pretty lackluster, and I threw in a little bit about how much I hate it. Oh, I guess I'm doing that. Yeah, the battle scenes suck, both in Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. As many of you know, this is a topic I have a lot to say about, but I'll try to keep it short. There are 4 battles in the extended edition of Gods and Generals. First Manassas, or Bull Run if you're a meddling Yankee, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville. And because this movie stretches its resources across 4 major battle scenes, it doesn't manage to do justice to any of them. First off, we need to be told with title cards what regiment or brigade we're looking at any given time. Even if it mattered, which it doesn't, you know you're in trouble when you have to do this. Do we really need to know that this is Brigadier General Raleigh Colston's division? No, they're Confederate soldiers advancing, that's all we need to know. It's ironic that Maxwell feels the need to show us which division is which, because when the battles get started, we get no sense at all of the tactics involved, which I would argue is way more important to get across. Okay, so that's not entirely fair. 2 out of the 4 battles do show us tactics, but in a super simplistic, dumbed-down way. At Fredericksburg, the Yankees advance uphill against an entrenched Confederate position, and at Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson ambushes the 11th Corps and routs the Union flank. At First Manassas, we have to be told that the Confederates are losing.
Sir, the day is going against us.
If you think so, sir, you had better not say anything about it.
Come on, man, show, don't tell. This is like the first rule of movie making. I should be able to tell that they're losing by seeing the troop movements and the worried look on the commanders' faces. So many other filmmakers have done it well. Gods and Generals is just lazy. It's a similar story with the Battle of Antietam, and it's a real shame, because Antietam was one of the most consequential battles of the war. But all we see is some artillery fire and a handful of middle-aged reenactors facing off in a cornfield that I assume was supposed to be Miller's cornfield. You know, the site of the most savage fighting of the bloodiest single day of the entire war. Wow, look at that carnage. Oh look, the guy's water bottle got shot. He could be dangerously dehydrated. Apart from all the Lost Cause stuff, the goreless PG-13 battles are Gods and Generals' biggest crime against historical authenticity. As far as I'm concerned, you can't accurately depict the battles of the Civil War without showing rivers of blood. This is a first-hand account of the Battle of Antietam from Christoph Niederer of the 20th New York Infantry. I had just got myself pretty comfortable when a bomb burst over me and completely deafened me. I felt a blow on my right shoulder, and my jacket was covered with white stuff. I felt mechanically whether I still had my arm, and thank God it was still whole. At the same time, I felt something damp on my face. I wiped it off. It was bloody. Now I first saw that the man next to me, Kessler, lacked the upper part of his head, and almost all his brains had gone into the face of the man next to him, Merkel, so that he could scarcely see. Since any moment the same could happen to anyone, no one thought much about it. Oh no, not the water bottle! If you don't show the violence as it really was, it gives the impression that the Civil War was more like a camping trip than an actual war.
As well, that war is so terrible. But we should grow too fond of it.
Doesn't seem so terrible, Lee. Seems kind of fun, actually. And confusing, my God. With the exception of Fredericksburg, there's absolutely no sense of geography to these battles. We see cannons firing, but there's no rhyme or reason to their deployments and targets. Shells come out of nowhere to bloodlessly land at the feet of stuntmen. We see the general's point of view, but without understanding fully what we're even looking at. Who fucking cares that it's Colston's division?
Mr. Pendleton, ride to General Hood. Ask him, can he maintain his position?
Yes, sir. Can he maintain his position?
What's going on with General Hood? This is the first time we're hearing about him in this entire fucking movie. Does Ron Maxwell just assume that everybody watching this already knows the intimate details of the tactics of these battles? Well, yes, because... You've probably already gathered by now that this film has a super limited appeal, and my theory is that it was made solely for reenactors, particularly Confederate ones. Exhibit A is this bizarre scene where Jeb Stuart sends a nice new coat to Stonewall Jackson, and everybody has this, like, weird American Psycho moment with it.
Look at that subtle off-white coloring. The tasteful thickness of it. Oh my God.
The only thing that can turn middle-aged men into squealing fashionistas is a brand new piece of reenacting gear. And I say that with love. Despite having my reservations about the somewhat toxic nature of reenacting culture, I really appreciate reenactors' passion for history and detail.
Man, Barney, if you're going to be General Grant, you have to have a drink. Yeah, but I'm a recovering alcoholic.
That said, what most people find interesting about the Civil War isn't the minutia of military uniforms and gear. It's the incredible stories of the people involved, their bravery, resilience, and all too human fallibility. I think it's very telling that the costumes and sets of Gods and Generals are painstakingly accurate, but virtually everything else, from its kid-friendly violence to its insulting pro-Confederate bias, is less realistic than Paul Blart Mall Cop.